The Indigenous Reference Group from the Prime Minister and Cabinet and the Australian Federal Government met in Kununurra. Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Nigel Scullion, made a significant announcement regarding funding for proposals by the Indigenous Reference Group developing the North.
Well, there's been a long-standing dialogue between Indigenous people in Northern Australia and various governments, and that's been going over 15 years now. Last year, there was an announcement to establish the Indigenous Reference Group, and some leaders from Northern Australia accepted that, and we've been working very closely with ministers and bureaucrats in Northern Australia around the role and position of Indigenous people, who are the majority resident population and majority landowners in Northern Australia, about their involvement in Northern Australia. So last week in Kununurra, there was a very positive meeting between the Indigenous Reference Group and Northern ministers, chaired by Matt Canavan, the leader in the Northern deliberations on behalf of the National Party, to talk about how Indigenous people would become part of that vision for Northern development. There was a lot of work that was leading into the meeting in Kununurra last week, including looking at successful Indigenous organisations, but also policy settings that have worked, or perhaps some that haven't worked so well but could be tweaked. And so there was lots of research that informed the Indigenous position that was put to the Northern Ministerial Forum around greater participation of Indigenous people, and it's really focused on engaging Indigenous people in purely commercial activities rather than focusing solely on the social and the cultural aspects. There was a number of recommendations that were accepted on the spot, and those recommendations really are around tweaking things like the procurement guidelines in Northern Australia, but there are a number of recommendations that the Ministerial Forum requested of the IRG to go away and do further work on, 20 in total. So they've committed additional support, and not just financial but other support from their government agencies, to continue working with the IRG to further work on those recommendations and come back to the Northern Ministerial, which is at the end of this calendar year. Given my history in working in these Northern Ministerial discussions, I think it is quite successful, and I think that's because of the changing nature of the political landscape, but also the fact that the political landscape has really just accepted, after all these years of land rights and native title in Northern Australia, that Indigenous people do have long-standing rights and interests, and at the end of the day, Indigenous people aren't going anywhere. So if we talk about the looking to the north, and that's where the business opportunities are, there is a long-standing historical connection there between Indigenous people and Macassans, and it's a natural sort of place for many people in Northern Australia to look, and that's been part of, I guess, the education program. And so the work in the future is really about positioning Indigenous businesses so we can participate in these emerging economies, as well as these already existing orthodox economies in Northern Australia around cattle industries, the buffalo industry, and some of these industries where the assets are on Aboriginal land but aren't necessarily being utilised wholly by Indigenous people. Well, I think there's many things to do, and obviously to finish the work of the IRG and also continue supporting Indigenous agribusiness, one of these new potentials that have come along, and with the work of the Aboriginal Land and Sea Economic Development Agencies, the requirement for research and development to be working a lot more closely with Indigenous people, and there's certainly a need and recommendations to support a unique Indigenous research hub in Northern Australia, so they can focus on the questions that are besotting Indigenous communities and Indigenous or corporations. A lot of the R&D unfortunately goes to non-Indigenous institutions like universities, and we do need a specific effort to look at the questions that Indigenous people are grappling with around their social and their cultural, as well as their economic aspirations.